we don't always look at culture the same way, and we might not always agree with the policies that we might see in culture, in our communities. So there are things that we have to sort of either accept and adapt to, or tolerate, or learn to appreciate as things change and become an influence in a community, right? And these are, some of the hot topics that we might be discussing right now, stuff like religion or politics, and politics probably right now because of what's going on in the political world with the elections, whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, and it's creating a massive amount of conflict within communities. Things like abortion and guns and weed, the environment, right? Another very big topic here in Colorado, because Colorado is very much focused on the environmental impact. So all of this stuff is looked at, it is compared. There are things that we might all agree upon for certain things, and then we might have very distinct ideas on other things. But what sort of keeps a community is that they have a majority of things that they all agree upon. And those are things like language, right? Language, keeps us together, right? It's a means of communicating and being able to understand and appreciate where someone else is coming from. Certain basic ideals that a community might share. So yeah, a lot of this stuff can be appreciated, but it can also be in conflict. And that's going to happen in large-scale communities. And certainly is happening right now on the national stage, where politics is, politics. Man, we'll at various points throughout the semester, we're going to be diving into politics and what's going on. My general approach, I don't, as far as I'm concerned, as your professor, as your teacher in this, I don't usually take sides on whether one particular way is right or one particular way is wrong. What I'm more interested in is figuring out the why. Why are certain people who belong to a political party, why do they believe that? And why it's important to understand why people believe that. And being able to open up that dialogue between, let's say, the Democrats and the Republicans. I think one of the major issues that we have in this country stems from a lack of civil discourse. Instead of yelling at Facebook and throwing out, memes and stuff like that and trying to get attention towards certain ideas, a lot of times we're not communicating. And come to find out, a lot of people really do share a lot of the same ideals and beliefs, but they're not listening and they're not willing to listen. And so what I try and do is not create that divide, but try to create, and hopefully with you, to understand why it's important to understand what's happening. Not necessarily to place blame, but to comprehend and then build bridges, right? And that's what anthropologists are oftentimes doing, is trying to build that bridge, trying to educate, and to allow people to understand what's going on in that community. So we might talk a little bit about politics and various different things, but I promise you it's not going to be, rah-rah Biden, rah-rah Trump. It'll be, let's talk about why. Why are these two different things happening? So, yeah, getting back on subject. one of the things that we've talked about is cultural change. And I talked a little bit about that with, especially like here in Denver, where we used to be like a cow town. Well, we're not anymore. Culture is never static. The only time that a culture is static is when it is dead. Okay, and cultures do die. Not often. They don't often die. But, and this is because to have a culture die, you usually have to have all the people die as well. And that's hard to do. But it might change. And that can happen to a culture, and that element of a culture can then die off. And we'll talk about that later on. But the thing that we have to always understand is that culture is never static. It is constantly changing. It is constantly adapting, growing, and it all has to do with populations as they change, as a city might grow or it might lose its population. All of this stuff can change drastically. And so, if we look at, again, bringing up like the Denver metro area versus like rural communities, one of the things that we're seeing in Colorado is that there are rural communities that are starting to disappear. A lot of folks that are living out there that might have had agricultural jobs are finding that you've got big ag companies that are coming in and buying up their farms. And they're leaving the rural areas and going to larger towns or to metropolitan areas. So you have a lot of people coming from rural communities to urban communities. And what this is doing is it's changing how these communities are adapting or not adapting. When you have people leave, you have less change take place because you're going to have less stimulus within that community. So when you have places like Denver that we're gaining 100,000 people a year in the metro area, that's a lot of extra influence coming in. Those are a lot of different ideas, a lot of different tastes, a lot of different experiences that they're going to be bringing to these communities. So we have to take that into consideration when we're talking about cultural change. What's happening with immigration or migration patterns. Culture itself, we oftentimes have like these central ideas of what culture is. We will focus on certain things that are very specific. They can be religious in nature, depending on your community. It can be something like the American dream, right? The ability to make something of yourself. And these things can be very distinct for different people. One of the reasons why the United States has had such a very large and long history of immigration here is because of this concept of the American dream. That no matter what, if you move here, you can accomplish anything that you want. And to a very certain degree, that is true. In other cases, it's not so true. The American dream is a complicated subject, and we'll get to that at various points throughout the semester. But what we're going to do now is sort of focus on these four elements of culture that anthropologists oftentimes use to sort of break down cultures into manageable, bite-sized pieces that we can ingest and then process. And these are norms, values, symbols, and mental maps. If we look at norms, basically norms are guidelines for how we live. Okay, these are basically how people should behave given any circumstance they find themselves in. So what does that mean? Well, That's, say, how you might behave in front of a judge might be different from how you behave in front of a class, right, as a student, versus how you might behave as an employee at your job, right? Or at your, did I say grandmother's house? I might have said grandmother's house. But if you go to your grandma's, right, you're not going to sit there unless you've got a really cool grandma. And you're not going to sit there and start dropping F-bombs and stuff like that. That kind of behavior isn't appropriate, to say that kind of stuff in front of your grandma, usually. But it is okay to say that in front of your friends, or depending on what kind of a job you have, it might be okay to do that kind of stuff with your coworkers, or it might not be, right? You might have very strict rules within that workplace where you have a very specific attire that you have to wear. You have to wear, maybe it's a corporate office, and so you have to wear, nicely pressed shirts and, wear makeup and, a jacket or shoes, nice shoes. Most places make you wear shoes. But what I'm saying is that how you behave depends on any given environment that you're in. So we have all these different norms that dictate our behavior. And all of these things can be contested, right? There might be some things that that could be acceptable, that you might be pushing on the edge of. There can be some consequences or no consequences or harsh consequences based off of these norms. Oftentimes norms are turned into what we consider laws, right? So there are things that our given society might say, hey, this is appropriate and this is inappropriate, and we turn it into a law. And then there are penalties for, doing something that breaks that law or that cultural norm. Norms can change drastically sometimes. Sometimes it can be minor changes, or it can be drastic change, excuse me, depending on who you are, whether or not you're a man or a woman, whether or not what your race is, what your ethnicity is, and those are two very distinct things. And we'll get into that much later. What your age is, whether or not you're a child or an adult or an old person, right? Your behavior might change depending on your age. There are things that might be appropriate for kids to do and older folks not to do. So there are all these different things. It can be affected by your sexual orientation or your gender, whether or not you're a cis male or a cis female, or if you're trans. All of these different things can change depending on who you are. These norms might be very different. So the other thing is that, especially in large communities like ours, you might have norms that are also not followed. You might have a subculture that decides to exclude themselves from following certain standards that might be appropriate. And oftentimes they can also become agents of change within those norms. And that is sometimes how change takes place, because you might have a group of people, and certainly this is the case with like the LGBTQ community, where it used to be inappropriate and against the norms and against laws to be LGBTQ, and then the community comes forward and says, enough's enough, we need to have change, and they break those norms and then help to create new norms. Right, so there's that cultural change taking place. So you might have folks that don't follow the normal cultural norms and then might change them. Or not. They might not do anything. They just might not do anything with that. If we look at values, values are extremely important to a community. These are things that are defining factors that are very hard to change within a community. These are the things that are very, very important and become sort of the dictators of how we should behave, right, in general. Right? Norms help sort of shape this thing, and norms can become values, but norms can be changed and can be done so relatively easily depending on the community. Values, on the other hand, not so much, right? And values also are capable of influencing and sort of reinforcing certain behaviors. One of the big things that we have in the United States is a value for the military, right? So if you join the military, you have a chance of dying, right? That there's a real chance that you could go into a foreign country and get killed. I would say most sane people would say that's a bad idea, right? I don't want to die. I don't want to get killed. But values, what they can do is they can influence you enough to say, you know what, this is something that I really care about. This is something that is so important to me that I'm willing to risk my life to fulfill this need that is there. So values can make people do all kinds of amazing things and risk their life or risk their families or all kinds of stuff. But it's so important that they do this that they will fly in the face of reason sometimes. So yeah, they're very powerful. They are hard to change. And it's something that when we find a value within a culture, it really helps us to define, what is this culture really going for? What is it that they're very interested in, and how does that affect or impact that community? We have symbols. Symbols are everywhere. Everything that we look at can usually be associated how we communicate. So language, okay. So language is a symbolic process. We use sounds that we put together to communicate an idea, right? And language isn't just spoken, but it can be nonverbal gestures, right? It can be written. It can be through smell, space. We'll talk about language here in a couple of weeks, but it can be the distance between you and me, how close I get to you or how far away you get from me can tell me information about what's going on with that relationship. So language is very important to understand, but it is filled with symbols that we use to communicate ideas. If we look at other systems of symbols, one of the big things, let's take Christianity or religion in general, but Christianity specifically, there are a number of things that represent the church. So whenever you see a cross, right? Well, that cross becomes a symbol of Christianity. If you look at the Bible, right? That also is a symbol, or say you're driving down the road and you see a sign that's on the side of the road and it looks like a little church. Well, you know that there's a church there, right? Because you get what that symbol is and what it represents. One of the really interesting things about symbols is that they can have very important meaning to that symbol. So that's just say, I found a cross and I broke it, right? I broke that cross. I snapped it right in half. Well, you're really just breaking like, a piece of wood in half, and it's no big deal. It's not really doing anyone any harm, except for the fact that it has a representation. It has meaning behind it. And you are essentially attacking the meaning behind that symbol. So, if you engage in something, if you, let's say, you wear a particular style of clothing, and and I'll use for an example, like the MAGA hats, right, for Trump. People that wear MAGA hats have two things that are going on. One is that they are expressing their symbolic appreciation and fellowship with the Trump campaign and the White House. At the same time, it has become an antagonistic symbol for people that are opposed to Trump. So they see that hat and they automatically dislike you for wearing it. So it can be a really important thing to understand what these symbols represent and what is the impact that these symbols might have given any individual or community, and how you approach those symbols. If we look at like the government, right, the flag, if we look at the American flag or the Colorado flag, they are a symbol. They represent an idea, a concept. The same with like the White House. You see the White House, you know who it represents, right? All you have to do is see that image and oh, okay, so this is coming from the president. Money. Money is symbolic, right? That piece of paper that you hold in your hand is absolutely worthless as a material object. What has worth is the symbology behind it. That $1 bill represents, $1 worth of something else, right? It's either we used to have a gold standard in this country. We don't anymore. But it used to be that $1 represented $1 worth of gold. Or you've got that $100 bill, and that represents something else. And that's how we trade. We trade symbolically through this process. So the money itself is oftentimes very symbolic, and especially in sort of a modern age. The difference used to be sort of with like coins. Coins actually used to be made out of precious metals, and so you actually had a physical object that this coin is actually worth like this much because it's made out of silver, it's made out of gold, or it's made out of nickel. So when we did a lot of work with coins, it had a different representation. Now coins have very little actual value. They are, again, more representation of cash or of worth. So there's all kinds of different ideas behind symbology and what they can do and how important it is to understand what it is that they mean, what they represent, and what you believe when you display those symbols, right? When you wear that MAGA hat or that Broncos jersey, or when you go out and buy something and use cash to do it. So they all have different importance. And so we have to understand why and what's important behind those symbols. And we get to mental maps of reality. Mental maps of reality. The first time I ever heard that, I was like, what is that? What is a mental map of reality? Essentially, what mental maps are is how we organize the world around us. Okay? It's how we organize things. It's how we classify things. It's how we stereotype things. It's how we divide things. It's how we group things. It can be inclusive. It can be exclusive. But it's how we look at the world. Why do we have fruits and vegetables? Right? They're both plants. Right? They're both plants. And both fruits and vegetables will have seeds. So they both got seeds. But there's something that's different about them. And we all decide that, you know what, these are vegetables over here. These are fruits over here. And now we're going to classify them. We're going to classify the different types of fruits and vegetables there are. But why did we do that in the first place? Well, we saw differences. We saw the things that separated these, and then we had to classify them. So mental maps help to organize the world around us. It helps us to organize the things that we find important to us. When we were talking earlier about local culture, right? Denver culture versus Colorado culture versus national culture. We know who the mayor of Denver is, but do we know who the mayor of like Cortez, Colorado is? Probably not. But this fits into your mental maps. What's more important? Your local expression, the local things that you're seeing and experiencing versus stuff that's outside. So if you were to say like draw a map, you know, and I hate necessarily using maps as a tool here, but you might draw like Denver as this really big part of the map, and then other things around the country get smaller and smaller and smaller because it has less of an impact on you. But really, it's how we organize the world around us, how we see things, how we are able to understand basic concepts. Why do we use a base 10 counting system? Right? We count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Why do we do that? Oh, yeah. Now I get it. Now we've got 10 digits right here, right? But then why do we have sort of the English version where we have feet, where it's 12 inches in a foot and 36 inches in a yard, right? Why do we have these two different systems in place? And then why do we have the metric system as well? Mental maps are the reason why we have like a base 10 system. Okay, because how are we able to understand what's going on in the world? How do we divide things up? Well, if there are 3 people and there's 32 apples, we can kind of sit there and go like, oh, well, if we each divide these apples into 3 groups, everyone will come out pretty well equal, with the exception of 2 additional apples. And then you got to figure out what you're going to do with those apples. I say, just split them up evenly. Can you do that with 2? Yeah. But that's the thing, right? How do we organize things? What if we had 7 fingers on each hand, right? Or what if we only had like 3 on each hand? How would that change how we see the world around us, right? Would we, if we see everything in sets of 3, would that be a base 6 system, right? Would we have like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then, something like that. So all of this depends on how we organize the world. And that's what mental maps do. It allows us to go through and look at various different subjects, different aspects of culture, and start to organize them and see how people organize these different things. What's important to them and how do they count? Not everybody counts in tens. In this world, and we'll watch a film later on in the semester, but not everybody uses 10s or 12s. There's some crazy counting systems out there. So yeah, it's all about how we define the world around us, and how we put things into categories. And this is also how we created concepts of race. Because someone has light skin, someone has dark skin. They are different. And people said, well, they're different, so we need to treat them differently. Changing how that looks is also an important thing that anthropologists do, is how do we actually see the world and how do we actually engage in it. So yeah, we're going to be getting into that subject quite a bit. Let's see. Mental maps are also created through enculturation. Again, it's something that is taught to you. It is something that you are not necessarily responsible for learning, because it's what happened. It's the community that you grew up in. It's the environment that you grew up in. So there isn't a lot of choice when it comes to growing up and learning how to see the world, right? It's a part of culture, and culture usually doesn't give a lot of choice in how people are taught. They just become exposed to those things, and then you incorporate that into your life.